The morning sun cast harsh light across the blackened ruins of what had once been the most prosperous ranch in all of Clearwater County. Elijah Thornton stood among the charred remains of his life's work, his weathered hands trembling as he surveyed the devastation that a single night of wildfire had wrought upon everything he had spent 30 years building. Where his grand ranch house had once stood, only the stone chimney remained, reaching toward the sky like a skeletal finger, pointing accusingly at the heavens. The barn that had sheltered his prize-winning cattle was nothing but a heap of twisted metal and ash. His fences lay in smoldering ruins, and the pastures that had once been green with carefully cultivated grass were now scarred patches of black earth stretching to the horizon. Elijah's cattle, those that had survived the fire, wandered aimlessly across the burned landscape, their mournful lowing a constant reminder of the magnitude of his loss. The old rancher had managed to save perhaps a dozen head from his herd of 200, and even those showed the singed marks of their narrow escape from the inferno. The fire had started 3 nights ago during a violent thunderstorm, when lightning struck a dead pine tree on the ridge overlooking Elijah's property. The combination of drought conditions and high winds had turned a single burning tree into a raging wildfire that consumed everything in its path. Elijah had fought the blaze with desperate fury, but one man against nature's fury had proven pitifully inadequate. Now, as he stood in the ruins of his dreams, Elijah could hear the sound of approaching horses. He turned to see a group of riders from town making their way up the valley, and his heart sank as he recognized the faces of men who had once called him friend and neighbor. Leading the group was Mayor Franklin Pierce, a portly man whose expensive suit and polished boots marked him as someone who had never known the harsh realities of ranching life. Beside him rode banker Jonathan Whitmore, cattle buyer Samuel Morrison, and several other prominent citizens of Clearwater Springs. "Morning, Elijah," Mayor Pierce called out as the group drew near, his voice carrying a tone of false sympathy that made the old rancher's jaw clench with anger. "Heard about your misfortune. Terrible thing, losing everything to a fire like that." Elijah nodded curtly, not trusting himself to speak civilly to men he suspected had come more to gloat than to offer genuine condolences. The relationship between himself and the town's leadership had been strained for years, ever since Elijah had refused to sell his water rights to the Clearwater Development Company. Banker Whitmore dismounted and walked among the ruins with obvious interest, his calculating eyes assessing the value of what remained. "Quite a loss, Thornton. I'd estimate the damage at well over $10,000. That's more money than most men see in a lifetime. Good thing you had that insurance policy we discussed," Mayor Pierce added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh wait, that's right. You decided insurance was too expensive for a man of your circumstances." The cruel reminder of Elijah's financial constraints hit like a physical blow. The insurance premiums had indeed been beyond his means, a fact that these men had used to pressure him into considering their various business propositions over the years. Cattle buyer Morrison walked over to examine the surviving livestock, shaking his head with exaggerated dismay. "Afraid these animals aren't worth much in their current condition, Elijah. I might be able to offer you $50 for the lot, and that's being generous considering the cost of getting them back to market condition." $50 for cattle that had been worth over $3,000 just a week earlier. Elijah's hands clenched into fists as he realized the extent to which these vultures intended to profit from his misfortune. "I'm not ready to sell yet," Elijah replied through gritted teeth. "I'm going to rebuild." The announcement was met with barely concealed laughter from the assembled men. Mayor Pierce exchanged meaningful glances with his companions before responding with mock concern. "Rebuild? Elijah, be realistic. You're 65 years old with no savings, no insurance, and no family to help you. Even if you could somehow raise the money to start over, it would take years to get back to where you were." Banker Whitmore nodded sagely. The smart thing would be to cut your losses while you still can. I'd be willing to purchase your land for a fair price, say $1 per acre. That would give you enough money to relocate somewhere more suitable for a man in your position. $1 per acre for land that was worth at least $25 per acre, even in its current burned condition. The insult was so blatant that Elijah wondered if these men had somehow orchestrated the fire themselves, though he had no proof of such a monstrous conspiracy. "Gentlemen," Elijah said with as much dignity as he could muster, "I appreciate your offers, but this land has been my home for 3 decades. I'm not ready to abandon it just because of one setback." The men exchanged looks that suggested they had expected this response and had prepared for it accordingly. Mayor Pierce's expression hardened as he abandoned any pretense of sympathy. "One setback. Elijah, look around you. There's nothing left but ash and debt. You're living in a fantasy if you think you can rebuild from this. No bank will loan money to a man your age with no collateral. No relatives will come to help someone they've never heard from. And no workers will take promises instead of wages. Furthermore," Banker Whitmore added, "there's the matter of your outstanding loans. The mortgage on this property is still due, fire or no fire. If you can't make the payments, which seems inevitable given your circumstances, the bank will be forced to foreclose." Elijah felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the reality of his situation became clear. These men hadn't come to offer help or even to gloat. They had come to deliver an ultimatum. Accept their insulting offers now, or lose everything anyway when the foreclosure proceedings began. "How long do I have?" Elijah asked quietly. "The next payment is due in 6 weeks, Whitmore replied with satisfaction. $800, as I'm sure you remember. $800 might as well have been 8 million for all the chance Elijah had of raising such a sum from the ruins of his ranch. The old man felt years of pride and determination crumbling like the ashes at his feet. As the group prepared to leave, Mayor Pierce delivered one final insult disguised as advice. "Elijah, there's no shame in admitting when you're beaten. Sometimes a man has to know when to fold his cards and walk away from the table." The sound of their laughter echoed across the burned valley as the men rode away, leaving Elijah alone with the remnants of his shattered dreams. The old rancher sank to his knees among the ashes of his home, feeling every one of his 65 years weighing down on his shoulders like stones. For 30 years, Elijah Thornton had been known throughout Clearwater County as a man who never gave up, who could overcome any obstacle through sheer determination and hard work. Now surrounded by the evidence of nature's destructive power and man's casual cruelty, he wondered if his reputation had been built on nothing more than youthful arrogance and good luck. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, Elijah remained kneeling in the ashes, staring at the ground where his house had once stood. Somewhere beneath the charred debris lay the foundation, stones that he and his late wife had laid with their own hands when they were young and full of hope for the future. The memory of Martha's laughter filled his mind, along with her voice encouraging him during the early struggles that had seemed so manageable compared to this ultimate disaster. She had died 10 years ago, taken by the same fever that had claimed so many others during that terrible winter. And Elijah had often wondered if his motivation to continue ranching had died with her. Now, facing the complete destruction of everything they had built together, Elijah finally understood the answer to that question. Without Martha's love and support, without the dream they had shared of creating something lasting in the harsh Wyoming territory, he was nothing but a stubborn old man clinging to ashes and memories. The sound of light footsteps caused Elijah to look up from his contemplation of despair. Walking across the burned ground toward him was a small figure that seemed to shimmer in the heat waves, rising from the blackened earth. As the figure drew closer, Elijah realized it was a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, carrying a battered cloth bag and moving with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to trust the ground beneath her feet. The girl who approached through the ruins of Elijah's ranch was unlike anyone the old rancher had seen in Clearwater County. Her clothes, though clean and carefully mended, were clearly those of someone who had known hardship and travel. Her dark hair was braided simply and tucked beneath a worn bonnet that had seen better years. And her shoes showed the kind of wear that came from walking long distances on rough roads. But it was her eyes that captured Elijah's attention most forcefully. Despite her youth, they held depths of experience and sorrow that reminded him of his own reflection in recent years. These were the eyes of someone who had lost everything and learned to keep moving anyway. "Excuse me, sir," the girl said as she reached the spot where Elijah knelt among the ashes. Her voice carried a soft accent that suggested origins far from Wyoming territory, perhaps somewhere in the deep south. "Are you Mr. Elijah Thornton?" Elijah struggled to his feet, brushing the ash from his knees and trying to summon some dignity despite his circumstances. "I am, miss. Though I'm afraid you found me at something less than my best." The girl's eyes swept across the burned landscape with an expression that seemed more understanding than shocked. "My name is Rose Whitfield, sir. I've been traveling for several weeks, looking for work and a place to stay. I heard in town that you might be needing help." Elijah almost laughed at the bitter irony of the situation. "I'm afraid whoever told you that was misinformed, Miss Whitfield. As you can see, I don't have a ranch anymore, let alone work for anyone else." Rose studied the ruins thoughtfully, her young face showing a concentration that seemed far beyond her years. "What happened here, if you don't mind my asking?" "Wildfire 3 nights ago," Elijah replied, surprised by how much the simple words still hurt to say aloud. "Burned everything I spent 30 years building. House, barn, fences, most of my cattle. Left me with nothing but debt and the mockery of every important man in the county." The girl nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant by mockery. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Thornton. I know what it's like to lose everything and have people tell you it's your own fault for not being smart enough to prevent it." There was something in Rose's voice that made Elijah look at her more carefully. Beneath her composed exterior, he could see the same kind of pain that had been eating at his own heart for days. This child had indeed known loss, probably more than anyone her age should have to bear. "Where are your people, Miss Whitfield?" Elijah asked gently. "Surely you have family somewhere who are worried about you." Rose's composure wavered for just a moment before she regained control of her emotions. "My parents died of yellow fever in New Orleans 2 months ago. I have an aunt in California who might take me in, but I need to earn money for passage on the westbound stage." The simple statement hit Elijah harder than all of Mayor Pierce's cruel words combined. Here was someone whose suffering made his own troubles seem manageable by comparison. Yet she had approached him with offers of help rather than requests for charity. "Miss Whitfield, I appreciate your offer, truly I do, but I have no money to pay wages. The bank will probably foreclose on this property in 6 weeks, and I'll be lucky to avoid debtor's prison." Rose reached into her cloth bag and withdrew something that made Elijah's eyes widen with surprise, a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "I have $17 saved from odd jobs along the road. Mr. Thornton, if you're willing to share whatever shelter you can manage and whatever food you can provide, I'd be happy to work for you without wages until you get back on your feet." Elijah stared at the girl in amazement. $17 was more money than he currently possessed, yet this child was offering to work for nothing more than basic survival necessities. "Miss Whitfield, that's very generous, but I couldn't accept such charity from someone in your circumstances." "It's not charity, sir," Rose replied firmly. "It's partnership. You have land and experience, and I have energy and determination. Together maybe we can build something from these ashes." The word partnership seemed to hang in the air between them like a challenge to everything Elijah had been told about his hopeless situation. For 3 days, he had listened to men explain why rebuilding was impossible, why he should accept defeat gracefully and surrender his dreams to more practical people. Now, a homeless orphan girl was suggesting that the impossible might actually be achievable if 2 people were willing to work together and refuse to accept the limitations that others imposed upon them. Miss Whitfield, Elijah said slowly, even if I wanted to accept your generous offer, what could we possibly accomplish with $17 and a burned-out ranch? The men from town were right about one thing. Rebuilding from nothing takes resources that neither of us possess. Rose smiled for the first time since arriving, and the expression transformed her serious face into something radiant with hope and determination. Mr. Thornton, let me show you something my mother taught me before she died. The girl walked to a patch of ground near where Elijah's kitchen garden had once flourished. The earth there was blackened like everything else, but as Rose knelt and began digging with her hands, Elijah could see that the soil beneath the ash was still rich and dark. Fire doesn't destroy everything, Rose explained as she worked. Sometimes it clears away the old growth so new things can grow stronger than before. My mother used to say that the best gardens were planted in ground that had been burned over, because the ash makes the soil richer. From her bag, Rose withdrew a small packet wrapped in brown paper. When she opened it, Elijah could see dozens of seeds of various types, vegetables, herbs, and flowers that would provide both sustenance and beauty if they could be coaxed to grow in the harsh Wyoming climate. These are seeds I've been collecting during my travels, Rose continued. Each packet represents something I learned from families who were kind enough to share their knowledge with me. This is corn that grows well in dry conditions, beans that fix nitrogen in the soil, squash that stores well through winter, and herbs that can be sold for good money in town. Elijah watched in fascination as Rose selected a single corn kernel from her collection and pressed it into the ash-enriched soil. The simple act seemed impossibly optimistic given their circumstances, yet there was something about the girl's certainty that made him want to believe. One seed, Rose said, as she covered the kernel with earth and patted it gently. That's all any garden starts with, Mr. Thornton. One seed, planted in faith that tomorrow will bring rain and sunshine and the patience to wait for growth. The metaphor was not lost on Elijah, who found himself kneeling beside Rose in the dirt, his hands touching the same soil where his wife had once grown vegetables to feed their table. Miss Whitfield, even if we could grow enough food to survive, that still doesn't solve the problem of the mortgage payment. The bank wants $800 in 6 weeks. Rose's eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that suggested she had been thinking about this problem longer than their conversation had lasted. Mr. Thornton, how much do you think people in town would pay for fresh vegetables in the middle of winter? How much would they pay for herbs that could cure their ailments or spice their food? Elijah had never considered the possibility of intensive farming for cash crops rather than cattle ranching, but Rose's questions forced him to think about the economic potential of such an enterprise. Fresh produce was indeed scarce and expensive during the winter months, and people with money were often willing to pay premium prices for quality goods. It would take more than a few vegetables to raise $800, Elijah said cautiously. Yes, sir, it would, Rose agreed. But it would also take more than sitting in these ashes feeling sorry for ourselves. At least this way, we'd be working towards something instead of just waiting for defeat. The girl's words cut through Elijah's self-pity like a knife through butter, forcing him to confront the choice that lay before him. He could accept the town's verdict that he was finished and surrender his land for a fraction of its value. Or he could take a leap of faith with a homeless child who believed that miracles could grow from ashes if you planted the right seeds in fertile ground. A partnership is born from ashes and hope. But can one seed really grow into salvation? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how Rose and Elijah build their impossible dream. 6 weeks later, the early morning frost sparkled like diamonds across the most unlikely garden Clearwater County had ever seen. Where once there had been only blackened ruins and despair, now neat rows of green shoots pushed through the ash-enriched soil with the stubborn determination that characterized both the plants and the people who had planted them. Elijah Thornton moved carefully between the rows, his weathered hands gentle as he checked the progress of vegetables that had grown with remarkable speed in the nutrient-rich soil created by the fire. Beside him, Rose Whitfield worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to see opportunity where others saw only obstacle. The partnership between the old rancher and the orphan girl had proven far more productive than either had dared hope. Rose's knowledge of intensive farming techniques, combined with Elijah's understanding of local growing conditions, had created a market garden that was already supplying fresh produce to the restaurants and hotels of Clearwater Springs. "Mr. Thornton," Rose said as she carefully harvested the last of their premium lettuce, "I think we need to talk about the numbers." Elijah looked up from the tomato plants he was tending, noting the serious expression on Rose's face. Over the past weeks, she had proven herself to be remarkably astute about financial matters, keeping careful records of their expenses and income with the precision of a trained accountant. "How close are we to the $800? Elijah asked, though he suspected from Rose's tone that the news was not entirely good. Rose consulted the small ledger book she always carried with her. "We've made $647 from vegetable sales, herb sales, and the contract with Morrison's restaurant for daily salad greens. That's more money than anyone thought possible from such a small plot of ground." Elijah felt a surge of pride at their accomplishment, but Rose's expression told him there was more to the story. "But it's not enough, is it?" "We're $153 short with the payment due tomorrow," Rose confirmed. "I've been trying to think of ways to raise the additional money, but most of our crops won't be ready for harvest for another week or two." The reality of their situation settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. Despite working 18-hour days and achieving what most people would consider miraculous success, they were still going to fall short of the goal that would save Elijah's ranch. "Rose," Elijah said quietly, "I want you to know that these past 6 weeks have been the most hopeful I've felt since my wife died. Regardless of what happens with the bank, you've given me something precious, proof that it's possible to start over. Even at my age." The girl's eyes filled with tears at Elijah's words, but her voice remained steady. "We're not giving up yet, Mr. Thornton. I have one more idea, but it requires taking a significant risk." Before Elijah could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention toward the road. A large group of riders was making its way up the valley, and Elijah's heart sank as he recognized Mayor Pierce, Banker Whitmore, and several other prominent citizens who had come to witness his final defeat. "Right on time," Mayor Pierce called out as the group reached the edge of the garden. "I trust you have our $800 ready, Thornton?" Elijah straightened to his full height, drawing strength from Rose's presence beside him. "I'm afraid we're still short of the full amount, Mayor, but we've made remarkable progress, as you can see." Banker Whitmore dismounted and walked among the garden rows with obvious surprise at what he found. The transformation of the burned ranch into a productive farm was indeed impressive, even to someone who had come prepared to foreclose on the property. "I'll admit, Thornton, this is more than I expected from a man your age and a homeless girl," Whitmore said grudgingly. "But business is business, and a debt is a debt. If you can't make the full payment, the property reverts to the bank." It was then that Rose stepped forward, her young voice carrying across the garden with surprising authority. "Gentlemen, before you make any final decisions, I think you should know that this property is about to become much more valuable than your current assessment suggests." Mayor Pierce laughed dismissively. "Child, whatever fantasies you've been filling Elijah's head with, the reality is that this is still a burned-out ranch with a few vegetables growing on it." Rose smiled with the confidence of someone who held cards that the other players hadn't seen yet. "Actually, sir, this property is about to become the foundation of the most profitable agricultural operation in Wyoming territory." From her bag, Rose withdrew a thick folder containing documents that made Banker Whitmore's eyes widen with interest. "These are contracts with 4 major hotels in Denver, 2 restaurants in Cheyenne, and a produce distributor who supplies mining camps throughout Colorado Territory. They've all agreed to purchase our specialty crops at premium prices, guaranteed for the next 3 years. The assembled men stared at Rose in shock as she continued her presentation with the poise of a seasoned businesswoman. Our projected income for the first year alone will be over $5,000, with expansion possibilities that could triple that amount within 3 years. Elijah looked at Rose with amazement, realizing that she had been working on these contracts during her evening hours when he thought she was simply resting from the day's labor. The scope of her planning and ambition far exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Furthermore, Rose continued, we've received an investment offer from Carson Agricultural Company of Denver. They're willing to provide $2,000 in immediate funding in exchange for a 20% stake in our operation. Banker Whitmore snatched the documents from Rose's hands and studied them with growing astonishment. The contracts were indeed legitimate, signed by reputable businesses and guaranteed by established banks. The financial projections were conservative but realistic, based on market prices and demonstrated production capabilities. This changes things considerably, Whitmore admitted reluctantly. If these projections are accurate, this property is worth far more than the original loan amount. Mayor Pierce's face flushed with anger as he realized that his plans to acquire Elijah's land for development purposes were crumbling before his eyes. Even if these contracts are real, Thornton still doesn't have the $800 due today. Rose reached into her bag once more and withdrew the leather pouch containing her savings. Actually, sir, when combined with our earnings from the past 6 weeks and my personal contribution, we have exactly $803. The payment will be made in full, with $3 extra as a gesture of good faith. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the garden plants that had grown from ashes and determination. Elijah felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he realized that Rose had not only saved his ranch, but had transformed it into something far greater than it had ever been before. Banker Whitmore counted out the money with obvious reluctance, knowing that he was witnessing the collapse of a carefully orchestrated plan to acquire valuable property at below-market prices. The debt is satisfied, he announced formally. The property remains in Mr. Thornton's possession. As the defeated men mounted their horses and rode away, Elijah turned to Rose with overwhelming gratitude. How did you do all this without my knowing? Rose smiled with the wisdom of someone who had learned early in life that survival required both hope and practical planning. My mother always told me that miracles happen when you plant the right seeds in fertile ground and work hard enough to help them grow. But she also taught me that smart farming requires good business sense as well as good soil. The girl gestured toward the thriving garden around them, where vegetables grew in neat rows and the air buzzed with the sound of bees drawn to their flowering herbs. We started with one seed, Mr. Thornton, but that seed carried within it the potential for everything you see here today. Elijah looked across his transformed property, seeing not just the vegetables and contracts that had saved his ranch, but also the partnership that had grown between a broken-down old rancher and a homeless orphan girl. Together, they had proven that starting over was possible at any age, and that the most unlikely partnerships could produce the most extraordinary results. Rose, Elijah said, would you consider staying on as my permanent partner? I think we make a pretty good team. The girl's smile was radiant as she accepted the offer that would give her the home and family she had been searching for since her parents' death. I'd be honored, Mr. Thornton. We've got a lot more seeds to plant and a lot more miracles to grow. As the sun climbed higher over Clearwater County, it illuminated a garden that had grown from ashes and a partnership that had grown from desperation. The old rancher and the orphan girl had proven that with enough faith, determination, and practical wisdom, even the most hopeless situations could be transformed into something beautiful and profitable. The mockery of the townspeople had been replaced by respect. The burnt ranch had become a thriving agricultural operation, and two lonely people had found the family they had both been missing. From the ashes of disaster, they had built something far more valuable than what had been lost, a future filled with hope and unlimited possibility. What an incredible transformation! From ashes to abundance, from despair to triumph, Rose and Elijah proved that with hope, hard work, and partnership, miracles really can grow. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of triumph over adversity in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes in second chances and the power of never giving up. What was your favorite moment in this journey from ruin to success? Let us know in the comments below.